It's no secret that medieval people drank. A lot. We have made a lot of myths about why it was that medieval people drink so much. And all of them tend to conform to our own biases about the medieval period. We think about it as a time that's very dirty, when no one had any fun. But in actuality, the reason that people drank in the medieval period is they liked it. Today, we're going to be discussing medieval alcohol, and we'll see that whether you're a wine drinker or an ale drinker, a member of the laity or the clergy, or even a pub versus party person, there are a lot of reasons to drink, just like we do today. So, cheers. What did medieval Europeans drink? Well, there's a couple of staples. Probably the most popular is ale. And I say ale specifically here because beer doesn't actually come in until sort of the late medieval period and early modern period. It's not until hops are added to ale that something becomes beer. They also drink a lot of wine. Your wine consumption is also going to vary with where you live in Europe. If you live in Italy or Spain, say, you're much more likely to be drinking wine regularly than you are if you live here in York. They also occasionally drink mead. Not as much as you would think. It certainly does come up. It's a gorgeous honey alcohol, and it is around, but it's not something that you would be expecting to drink day to day. In certain places, like the West Country, you might also drink cider or perry. It's difficult for us to tell how much cider people drank in the medieval period because the words wine and cider are almost interchangeable for them. If you're making alcohol out of fruit, it just kind of is a wine. So we have to look out for clues about which fruit is being used in order to know whether they're drinking cider or they're drinking what we would call wine. You might notice that conspicuously absent from this list are harder forms of alcohol. And especially here in England, you won't see that come in until about the 17th century with the introduction of gin. So, a lot of drinking options, but probably no cocktails.
From homes to festivals, there were plenty of places where people could wet their whistle. Perhaps the most iconic of all is still a quintessential part of British culture even today. I mean, of course, the humble pub. And I've come to one of London's oldest pubs to enjoy a drink or two with an expert on everything to do with pubs and pints, author and pub expert Pete Brown.
Thank you so much for coming down to meet me in one of my favorite pubs in London. And it's also one of the oldest pubs in London, but technically it's not in London, is it?
No, we're in Cambridgeshire. I sometimes think when I come here we're in Narnia. You get this lovely little alleyway, and you're in this pub which is technically in Cambridgeshire because it belongs to the Bishop of Ely, or did belong to Bishop of Ely.
The hint's sort of in the name, the Old Mitre, yes?
The Old Mitre, Bishop's hat. This was granted to him by Queen Elizabeth, part of an estate, originally serving the estate and then became a public house. So you'd have quite sizable businesses just serving a family and its household and the servants. That was quite a common thing. Okay, so now we call pubs, it's a public house, but that's not a name that we would see in the medieval period, is it? We didn't start calling them that until about the 17th, 18th century. Before then, there were three entirely separate types of establishment. There were taverns, which mainly sell wine. They go back to the Romans, became briefly popular again in the Middle Ages when Henry II married Eleanor of Aquitaine. There are inns, which originally grew out of monasteries, and they're places that are much more catering to travellers, people going on pilgrimages. So it's accommodation, food, as well as drink. So there'd be bigger establishments on main roads. There was stabling for the horses. They're quite ornate and quite cosy. And then the basic one, the most important one in fact, is the alehouse. So people used to brew at home, like they used to bake at home. Some people were just better at it than other people. so those people would start selling it. And when you had a fresh batch of ale ready, you would put an ale stake up outside your house so that people knew it was ready. And this started off life as like being a broom, basically. And then they became a bit more elaborate. They started stretching out into the street and falling off and killing people. So the authorities went, okay, enough of the kind of big ale stakes, can we have a painted sign instead? Because the population were illiterate, these signs would be kind of highly recognisable things. Before Henry VIII split with Rome, there was a lot of popes' heads. Then after that, they became the king's head.
Right.
You'd have symbols of heraldry like the white hart, the red rose.
Yep.
And so this is where all pub names come from. They weren't originally named that. They were the names they were the things that the signs were depicting. It started off as someone's house. There'd be no bar in it. You'd walk in to buy some beer, mainly to take home. But there's just something about the conviviality of beer where it's like, actually, I'll just have some while I'm here. Oh, and here's Joe from down the street. Are you going to have one here? And so you get the kind of the everydayness of the pub coming out of the alehouse. Beer was such an important fact of life. It wasn't just a drink at the end of the working day. In towns and cities where the water sources were polluted, beer was safer than water to drink.
Sometimes people think that the only reason that anybody drinks beer in the Middle Ages is that the water is polluted, and it's like, that's not true. But in cities and towns,
Yes.
it gets a little bit more dicey.
It's been disproved because it's like there were nice, lovely streams in the Middle Ages. So
exactly.
Of course they were, but not in the middle of London. That was the toilet. There was a toilet in the middle of London, so you weren't going to drink out of that.
One of the big ways that we find out about brewing in the medieval period is actually the people who get in trouble. So you find out a lot about women, especially in the medieval period, who get in trouble because they brewed bad ale. And it's a big thing. There'll be a collective punishment where they have to go sit in a chair outside their house and everyone goes by and they're like, hey, Mary, that was awful ale you made. And that will be the literal punishment because it's so embarrassing to have made a really bad batch of ale.
Yeah, because it was so important.
The art of brewing was a serious business. To find out more about this important craft, I'm heading into London's East End. I've come to Wild Card Brewery to meet expert brewster Jaega Wise, who, using the methods of old, has crafted us a special medieval treat.
Jaega, thank you so much for having us here at Wild Card. I'm absolutely delighted to be here because one of the things that I think it's really important and great about Wild Card is that, like in the medieval period, we got a woman brewing. This is sort of what we would expect to see in commercial brewing now. What's the difference between home brewing and like industrial or commercial brewing?
So the four main ingredients in modern beer is yeast, water, malted barley, and hops. And that's quite different-ish to previously. So the malted barley, the water and the yeast stay pretty much the same. But hops didn't really come into brewing until around about the late 15th century.
Right.
Typically, you would use kind of herbs you would find out and about.
Okay, so this is the ingredients in a modern beer.
Yes.
But I understand that you have made for us a medieval beer.
Yes, I have made a medieval beer, and this is it. And one of the major differences, you may note first of all the colour.
Yeah.
It's quite dark.
Yeah.
So the technology to actually make light pale malt didn't come until considerably later.
Right.
So a lot of beer would have been quite brown.
Okay.
Quite murky brown. One of the other big differences between medieval brewing and modern brewing is hygiene. We're very good at sterilising everything, helping to give beer that shelf life, that stability it needs.
Yeah.
So back then, that wasn't so much the case. So beer likely would have soured quite quickly.
Oh.
So likely you would have picked up a little bit of tartness. One of the other major differences is hops. Hops have antibacterial properties. It's what helps to give beer stability and shelf life.
Right.
Hops were not particularly common in the UK. Previously to that, people would brew with herbs and spices, and herbs and spices that you would find out and about. So this is nettle, which is what I've made our beer with.
Ooh, exciting.
And mugwort as well.
Oh,
so
brilliant.
if you want to have a sniff of these.
So that's nice. It's kind of like almost like green tea or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It wasn't until really the late 15th century when hops were introduced into Kent. I think it was viewed as foreign.
Right.
But I think the practical properties of long shelf life on a product that you produce cannot be underestimated.
Right.
It's no surprises
Yeah.
that hops took over as the dominant flavouring flour for our beer.
Okay, so here's our ingredients. How do we take these and make a delicious beer?
So we start at the very beginning. So we have barley. So barley, when it grows in the ground, is very hard. So you have to do something called malt that barley.
Right.
And it's the process of making the carbohydrates and starches accessible for the brewer.
Okay.
In modern day society, there's a whole other industry known as maltsters who do that. Back in the day, you'd have to malt your barley yourself.
Okay.
So that would mean essentially tricking your barley into growing slightly and breaking down those starches into simpler starches and carbohydrates.
Right.
So the enzymes later can turn those carbohydrates into simple sugars,
Okay.
which is what we're trying to get, right? You would largely have to dry your barley at home. So you might do that in the air or you might do it over fire.
Right.
That might lead to, number one, colour.
Okay, yeah.
It's very difficult to produce those light in colour barley.
Yeah,
because you
yeah.
need a lot of equipment for that.
Of course, yeah.
And the second thing is a smoke. So in all likelihood, if you're drying barley over fire, you probably would get a slight smoky flavour to a lot of beer.
Okay.
So that's the first major differences between then and now, is us, we are able to produce this light, delicate colour, this
Right.
concept of the pale ale. Next, we steep it in hot water, and the purpose of that is to break down those carbohydrates into simple sugars, right? And that process has largely stayed exactly the same. And then you would, in modern day times, hop it. So that's when you would add your hops. Previously, that is the time when you would add your herbs and spices.
Right, okay, yeah.
But just the very nature of brewing with hops versus brewing with herbaceous material. Hops, in order to get the antibacterial properties, you need to boil it for a good hour. You probably wouldn't have done so if you were using mugwort or nettle or rosemary or thyme, things that grew locally. You probably just boil it maybe for 5 minutes.
Right, okay, yeah.
So that's another major difference in process. And then you would put it into a wooden barrel or a wooden vat. So in modern brewing, we have lots of stainless steel.
Nice.
So
yeah.
and one of the major differences between stainless steel and wood is you can clean it.
Yeah.
You can clean it really thoroughly. Wood harbours a lot of bacteria. There are lots and lots of different types of yeast that will be present in wood that would give your beer quite a unique flavour. So I can imagine that from different brew houses to brew houses, you get very, very different flavours depending on the microorganisms that were present in your brewing vessels.
Right.
So this concept of brewing the same thing twice, you could have a go.
Okay, right, yeah.
You could have a go, but our modern standards of going to the pub and having that exact same pint of ale every single time probably wouldn't be the same.
Right. In terms of flavor, what would we expect to see a difference between medieval and modern beer?
One of them would be the colour, so it would be darker in colour physically. The bitterness may be considerably lower because that's what hops does, it adds bitterness, and you have this kind of like herbaceous note. So you'd have that quality to the beer as well.
Right, okay.
And it's exciting for me as a brewer to be able to recreate some of these flavours and some of these tastes.
While you could expect flavors to differ drastically between different houses and locations, one thing that remained a constant by law was volume. There were certainly no half measures in the Middle Ages, because it's here that the iconic pint was born. In fact, it goes all the way back to Magna Carta in 1215. This celebrated document is more famous for restricting the king's powers, but Article 32 deals with other important matters, stating there should be a single measure for ale throughout the kingdom.
Serving a full measure was absolutely one of the most serious things in medieval history. In the Chester miracle plays, Christ comes back down to earth and pardons all these criminals, except the brewer who served short pints. And they get sent to hell.
Quite right too.
You couldn't actually measure the strength. There was no way of doing that back then. So you could measure the quantity.
Right.
And at least try and put some kind of control on it through that.
What are we serving said pint in?
We're serving that in tankards, maybe pewter ones like this, but maybe wooden or pottery more commonly than that.
Yeah.
But there's a great story that when you would buy a pint in something like this, that it would have a system of pegs inside. So that, and again, to try and control drinking, you were only meant to drink down to the next peg in one swig, so it's helping moderation. But of course, it was quite difficult to do, so you'd kind of miss it and go down to the next one, go to the next one. And there was this thing about being the last person standing when you were in a drinking thing. So if you wanted to teach someone a lesson, you'd take them down a peg or two in the pint.
Oh.
Great story. It's one of those that I kind of hope is true. One of the difficulties of researching the history of the pub and beer and drinking is that a lot of it was just everyday stuff, so it didn't really get written down and recorded. And also a lot of the archaeological record is stuff that doesn't last.
The history that we do is really similar. I'm interested in ordinary people and what they're doing. And I think that one of the ways that we really learn about that is through stories like that. So not only do you have these great stories that are told in pubs, but they're really the foundation of what English literature is in a lot of ways as well. because the Canterbury Tales are a series of tavern stories, and they're a series of tavern stories that starts in an inn, right?
Yes. The Tabard Inn in Southwark, the congregation point for the pilgrimage to Canterbury, is the start of the Canterbury Tales. It's the birth of English literature, and it takes place in a pub because you've got the knight and the wife of Bath and the priest and the pardoner and all these people. There's nowhere else that you get all those people together in one place apart from an inn. And the stories that they tell as they go down, Canterbury Tales doesn't describe the route from Suffolk to Canterbury. There's a lovely bit of land here, a nice view from. It's not that; it's the people telling each other stories, like you do over a few beers in an inn.
And now it's the time I've been waiting for, to get a taste of what the medieval pub goer would have experienced all those years ago, by enjoying our very own homemade medieval brew. We begin in a very 21st century, non-medieval way, by smelling our ale first.
I mean, the first thing that you notice is it is really malty, right? So it's really sweet, it's really full-bodied there, but you can taste the herbs coming through.
And can you smell just that little hint of tartness in there?
It does really have that edge that I would expect kind of from a sour or a goes, something like that.
But only incredibly lightly. Incredibly lightly.
Oh, that's really good.
It's good, isn't it?
It's really good.
It's good, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what's so interesting about it is you can really see why this battle between hops and between herbs got so intense, because it's really good.
Yeah, it is.
And flavoursome.
One of the things I definitely notice here is it is quite malty. It is really sweet. You've got that nice kind of like rounded complexity.
And a hint of smoke in the background as well.
Yeah, just a bit.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that is largely because the malts that they would have been using would not have been very well modified compared to modern standards. And when I say modified, I mean getting those starches and carbohydrates being able to be broken down into simple sugars. So because it's a industry that would largely have been done in the home, it would have been a bit inefficient in process. So I think a lot of the beer probably would have been quite sweet.
Right. So what sort of alcohol percentage would we expect to see in something like this?
So in something like this, you typically see between probably 3 and 5%. Well, this is a bit closer to the 5%.
So that's pretty high. So I guess this is something that I would expect to see, at table for, a holiday. Like you're going to have it at Christmas, you're going to have it at Easter. But they're drinking beer like all the time, right? So what are we having with breakfast in the morning?
You can pull off something called the first runnings, and that's when you take off the sugary, most luxurious part of the beer. And you can make a beer with that, and that beer would be stronger in ABV, stronger in flavour, more expensive to buy.
Right.
Fancy beer. Or you can take the last runnings, which is the opposite of that. So it's weaker, there's not much sugar left, and you can ferment that. And you would end up with a beer that's very, very low in ABV. So the kind of beer that you could drink and you could work, or you could get through your day whilst drinking lots of beer.
This is about what I would expect in terms of effervescence from an ale. Like there is something in there, but it's not like pétillant.
Yeah, the process of conditioning a beer hasn't really changed that much over the years. Especially in Britain, we use very traditional methods.
Right.
So this beer would go into a cask where it would then condition, and it would just get a little bit of fizz, but nowhere near the expectation of modern standards of carbonation.
Right. This is gorgeous, and I absolutely love it. But if I was going to go, in theory, next door in the medieval period, would I be presented with something that tastes like this?
Probably not. So one of the things that's really interesting is locally to me, where I brew, we've got Walthamstow wetlands. So here, nettle grows easily, mugwort grows easily. I can leave here and go and fetch some.
Right.
It's going to very much depend from household to household what grows locally in your area and what you have access to. So in all likelihood, most households will have a different herb mix, a different flavour mix. So you would get variations in recipe from house to house.
Is it also going to vary in terms of season to season?
Absolutely, because different herbs, they grow at different times of year. Currently in season, we've got mugwort and nettle, which is why I've chosen these particular herbs.
Right.
But other times of year, you'll have heather, you'll have rosemary, you'll have other herbs that you could use in your spice mix.
Jaega, thank you so much for having us. I'm absolutely delighted to try medieval beer, and I don't suppose I'm ever going to get to drink this down a pub soon, am I?
No, because it's got no shelf life.
So one of the things that's nice about being in an alehouse is you get great beer, it's very convivial, it's a real site of medieval pleasure, but you can also have a bit of a game, can't you? That's one of the things.
Yes. I mean, when people sit together drinking, there's always an element of competitiveness. And so it didn't take long for pubs to become places where games would be played. A bit later than what we're talking about, but Henry VIII was a great exponent of shuffleboard. The other aspects that was really popular was any variation on fighting.
Right.
whether that's people fighting, like prize fighting, bare knuckle fighting, or animals. So some of the most popular games in pubs for centuries were things like cockfighting or bear baiting. And when you look at a lot of the heraldry around pubs, the logo of several breweries, different breweries, is kind of fighting cocks. But yeah, anything that involves blood and anything that involves gambling was eternally popular in an alehouse.
The alehouse, tavern, or local inn would have been an important part of everyday life, offering not just a drink, but a communal hub of culture and information right across Britain. But this wasn't the only place where you could expect alcohol to be served. At some point, especially if you were better off, you would attend a feast or a banquet, a chance to really indulge in the finest food and drink.
The banqueting room here at the Barley Hall is a really interesting late medieval building because it's changed hands a few times. The way we see it now, all set up, would be for a very wealthy family having a feast. What you might also notice is there are a couple references to the kind of alcohol that you might expect to find at a feast. We have these lovely carafes which would be full of wine, and this would be a real great way of showing your status as a member of York's elite. You can bring in wine from overseas and give it to everyone at a party like this. However, you'll also notice we have small casks of ale on the table. So this is a nod to the fact that people always want beer and wine. You're never going to have one or the other, especially at a party as lavish as this. It's not a real big feast unless you have all of your options covered. The pleasure at the center of drinking in the medieval period is, of course, one of the major factors. However, people drink for any number of reasons on top of that. You might drink with a lot of friends in order to prove that you can afford it. Laying out a lavish feast like this, including a lot of wine, shows that you are in a financial position to do so. You might drink as a part of religious sacraments. Turning wine into the blood of Christ is at the heart of the Mass and an important part of everyday life for members of the clergy.
Because of its religious connotations, alcohol wasn't just important, it was sacred. Literally. And a religious building full of people doing God's work needed plenty of it, especially wine.
St. Mary's Abbey here in York is a good thing to think about how much booze the clergy would actually need. When I say that, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek because there are genuine religious reasons why clergy members need a lot of one thing in particular: wine. Of course, at communion, you take bread and wine, and by the process of transubstantiation, they become the body and blood of Christ. So, you need a lot of wine to turn into blood. Rich people like kings might import their wine from around Europe, but here in England, before the Little Ice Age, which starts in the 14th century, the church actually grew a lot of its own wine. Maybe not here as far north as Yorkshire, but certainly down in Kent, we can find monks and nuns who are engaging in viticulture, or the process of growing grapes for wine. And they make their own wine, so that's a job that you would have as a member of the clergy. And then that wine will get offered up during communion and you'll all enjoy it. But communion doesn't work the same way in the Middle Ages as it does now. Whilst monks and nuns might be having communion all the time, average people don't. It becomes a big sticking point later on when they move into the Reformation and away from Catholic practices, but actually regular people really want to take communion. Even when they are offered communion, maybe 4 or 5 times in their life for really big events, they get to take the bread, but they're often not offered wine. And part of the reason that they're not offered the wine is it's just really expensive. The clergy doesn't have a lot to go around, they're all taking communion all the time, so they can't let regular people indulge in it. However, there's plenty of leftover wine, really, and monks and nuns do enjoy that at table with their meals. That's in addition to ale, just like every other medieval person is also drinking. Monks and nuns drink it just as much as the average person, and they're drinking it more often than you'd think. They'll probably start off in the morning with a small beer, something that is really light in alcohol, and then work their way up through the day to the heavier alcohols with their dinner. In a place like St. Mary's, where you've got absolutely tons of monks and nuns around the joint, that means that you are going to go through a lot of ale every day. And ale also constantly goes off by its very nature, so you're going to have to always be running through the process of making more and more ale for your community. But this is not just the sort of work that you have to undertake as drudgery. For monks and nuns, working in the brewery is also seen as a form of prayer. The idea is because they've left the ordinary world behind them, all the work that they do is for the glory of God. So if you're down there brewing to make sure you have a really nice glass of ale with your dinner, that's actually a form of prayer.
One of the principles of being a courtly gentleman in the Middle Ages was hospitality. You were a man of standing if you were generous with what you had. And when people were travelling, there was no motorway service stations.
Right. Yeah.
You know, the pub was the place. You knew that there was a kitchen here. You knew that there was going to be beer here. And then became obviously more a commercial imperative as people travelled more and as cities grew larger to offer that and to make some money from it.
It's interesting you mentioned that there's this expectation even between, commoners or, members of the peasantry that they really have to have this kind of generosity towards each other. But that scales right the way up to even, the highest echelons of society, no?
Absolutely. And as you know, the royal court would often tour around the country. And so if you were a man of some standing with a decent sized estate, you might get notification one day that the Queen was coming to stay with her 200 strong retinue. And she was going to camp out in your garden and use your facilities for as long as she felt like. Queen Elizabeth had a particular reputation for enjoying her beer. And so whenever you got the notice that she was coming, you had to send round to all the local brewers to get some beer in. And there's one quote that her beer was so strong that not any man could touch it.
A woman after my own heart. If alcohol was a way of displaying wealth, then the lavish lifestyles of the royal court give us an idea about how much booze people would have had access to. To find out more, I'm meeting food historian Richard Fitch in the royal wine cellars of Hampton Court Palace, home to one of history's most indulgent monarchs, Henry VIII.
We are here in the wine cellar at Hampton Court Palace. It is a wine cellar literally fit for a king. What kind of wine are we expecting to see on an English king's table?
On an English king's table, foreign. So all around the Mediterranean, pretty much where we get wine from today. It's all about the status of being able to afford to import. Importation, the further something comes from, the more it's going to cost. So the further you can bring it, the more of a status symbol that you're providing.
How do you get something like this in here?
By boat, by barge, up the river. That's one of the principal reasons Hampton Court was built next to a waterway. If you were really in a bad state, by road on wagons, but then it's very much rolling. So the thing to remember with that is, of course, that you're just churning that wine up. So our modern notion of what is a good wine versus what a historic notion of a good wine is completely different.
Clearly, someone's job is to look after this, right?
So the department is the cellar, and that's overseen by the clerk of the cellary. And then he has within his department a sergeant and grooms. I think there are 2 sergeants and 2 grooms who work for the household, and they supply the wine and ale for the household. And then there's the equivalent of that position of the mouth, and they are the people that provide direct for the monarchs.
Medieval people like to simply throw some spice in something. Is that true from an early modern sense as well? Would you sweeten wine or add cloves?
Absolutely. Change the taste. That's part of the skill of the cellars department and the serving to people of status is understanding their temperament, what their health is. Does their food and drink need modifying to deal with that? What mood they're in? What are they trying to represent from that meal? Do they want to show that the spices they've obtained? Do they want to modify the flavour? And then modify that accordingly. And that's the skill that you as an employer are paying for that person.
How much wine would we expect a royal household to go through in, say, a month?
Hundreds of thousands. You're looking at people being supplied somewhere around 2 to 3 gallons a day as their allowance. That doesn't mean that's what they consume, but it's part of their bouche of court. So their allowance for actually being a courtier is they have wine, they can then give that on to other people. But that process happens whether they drink it or not. And the other thing you have to remember is once the cask has been opened, it has to be drunk. They can't be made re-airtight, so you have to process the whole lot or turn it into vinegar. In general, if you work within the court and you're a member of the household, then you are given wine or ale daily.
Even in a cellar at this size as well, would there be gradations of wine? So a monarch is more likely to drink something than, say, a lower member of the court?
Doesn't seem to work that way. What they seem to do is just supply wine, and it's what they can get seasonally, what's available, what quantities there are. And there doesn't seem to be that much of a differentiation between quality of wine. It's what they serve it with, how much they serve of it, and whether or not it's watered down. And it's all about the money. It's all about the status of seeing that your employer, the monarch in this case, has the ability to provide that. It's an expectation that you have of them.
The 1521 Field of the Cloth of Gold meeting between King Henry VIII and Francis I of France has gone down in history as one of the most shameless displays of wealth and opulence. It featured every medieval pleasure you could think of, including the Great Wine Fountain. And this painting captures the downside of drink too. Puking and fighting aren't far from the boozing.
I know that there are things, for example, of having wine fountains at court to just really show how much you have to show off. Clearly, that is going to be at some sort of festival, but how often would those large displays happen?
They seem to be focused on the very, very specific. So we know that there are table fountains from the continent that are later, early modern, so late 16th, early 17th century, and they seem to be around 4 or 5 foot tall. What we're more used to in thinking in terms of scale for England is converting conduits in the larger cities like London, and Berwick is another big one. So that when the monarch changes, or for Henry VIII, when his various wives change, they convert the conduits for water supply to wine supply for the cities.
I want to know where this is happening for me now. The Jubilee's coming up.
Absolutely. So free running wine. Here at Hampton Court Palace, we've got a representation of a wine fountain in our base court, and that's based on the image that is shown from the painting of the Field of the Cloth of Gold from the 1520s.
So you've got beer and wine fountains in a field. Do we know how they did that?
Unfortunately not.
Oh.
I'm suspecting some form of siphon system, but it's a pure guess. We've made a model out of one in the past to try it out, and it works through a siphon. And we know that the 17th century table fountains use a siphon system, but they run for a fixed amount of time, and all of the records show that these fountains ran constantly.
I suppose that it's theoretically possible to just have, again, a bunch of manual labor, but...
Yeah, absolutely. Labor's cheap, so...
There were a lot of different ways that people enjoyed alcohol in the medieval period. It might just be a quick drink before you go out to work in the fields. It might be at a festival or a tournament like this. Might be after a long, hard day of work. But one thing is for sure, people had all different kinds of reasons to enjoy booze. Because of the pre-industrial process of making alcohol, medieval people were actually a little more connected to what booze they were drinking and why. It wasn't just about the process of making alcohol, it was about the pleasure. And alcohol played an intrinsic part of pleasure in the medieval period. In our next episode, we'll be looking at some of the places that medieval people liked to enjoy booze. Specifically, we'll be talking about sport.
In our next episode, it's time to work off the excesses of all this alcohol with a bit of healthy sport. Next up, falcons, knights, and a spot of royal tennis.